It's a privilege and a pleasure to have Ambassador Ashok Kumar Mukherjee, former permanent representative of India to the United Nations. Ambassador Mukherjee was there at UN from April 2013 to December 2015, and those were exciting days, Ambassador. Let's begin with the top issue for most Indians and the United Nations, and that's of the Security Council. You were there at a time when the dialogue to democratize the Security Council moved a few paces forward. And do you want to say something about that troublesome issue which engages all of us?
Well, when I reached in April 2013, probably one of the first meetings that was held was of the Intergovernmental Negotiations on Security Council reform. And I had inscribed myself, it was the day I had given my credentials to Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, so I was a bit late. So I was one of the last speakers. I listened to what the other delegations were saying, and it struck me that they were saying things, but they were saying things without a framework of when they wanted to complete this discussion. And so in my intervention on that day, I put the idea forward that let us conclude this by the 70th anniversary of the United Nations. And I was pleasantly surprised to find the kind of response that we got to this idea of focusing Security Council reform negotiations with the 70th anniversary in 2015 in mind. We worked, therefore, in a context which was endorsed by the many heads of state in September that year when they came for the high-level segment. And the intergovernmental negotiation process itself got galvanized. So that when we reached the 70th session, which was in September 2015, we were able to look back at something that we had been able to achieve. And I think that the single substantive achievement that happened in those 2.5 years was the tabling of a text by 122 countries, including 2 permanent members, the UK and France, who gave their views on the 5 areas of Security Council reform that had been agreed to by the General Assembly in 2008. And this was the first time that member states had taken the trouble to write what they wanted and to put it in a compendium which was tabled by the President of the General Assembly, Sam Kutesa of Uganda, and adopted by the General Assembly on the 14th of September 2015 by consensus without a vote. I think that was a significant milestone. But, the problem is more complicated. And I look back, and I think the main complication is the attempt by the rest of the General Assembly to get the privileges of the veto-wielding permanent members into the mainstream of the United Nations. Because if you look at it, the UN Charter is democratic in every other provision. The General Assembly, one country, one vote. The Economic and Social Council, it's an elected body, but one country, one vote. Decision making is always on a democratic basis of majority voting if you don't have a consensus. It's only the Security Council that continues to be guided by Article 27 and the right of the veto which is given to those 5 permanent members. And I think today, when you look at it in the year 2018, the pushback to what was achieved in September 2015 has come from the permanent members led by China. And I think that that's a pity.
So where will the text-based negotiation move on? I mean, what are the future paces that we can expect?
You see, the intention of the Ambassador of Jamaica, who was the chairperson of this intergovernmental negotiation when the text was put together, was very transparent. He spoke to each of the delegations, not only the 122 which gave him their views, but also the others who had not given their views, including the permanent members. And the intention was to combine these views, which are contained in that document, and come out with an 8-page resolution of the General Assembly concerning each of the 5 areas of Security Council reform. What happened after that, as has been written about and spoken about by the Jamaican ambassador, in fact here in New Delhi at the IDSA, is that the entire integrity of the intergovernmental negotiation process has been compromised. It's been compromised by removing a single chair and introducing a concept of two co-chairs. Now, in the UN negotiations in any other field, two co-chairs always represent the two opposing points of view. But in the Security Council negotiation, you do not have a representative of a permanent member as a co-chair. And therefore, it's like playing a game without the main player in the room. The second is the text itself, which was tabled and adopted unanimously, has got diffused by what are called food for thought papers. And I follow this quite closely. Mm-hmm. And I'm surprised that 23 years after the negotiations began, now it's 27 years after the negotiations began, we are still having food for thought. There's not much to think about. We know what the issues are. And the worst part of this whole delay is that every year the numbers of people affected by violent conflict are increasing. The Secretary General keeps giving us the figure. When I was there, it was 60 million. Now it is 65.6 million. So who are these 5 additional million people going to blame for the delay in reforming the Security Council? And the answer of why the Security Council needs to be reformed is very clear. And again, it's a unanimous answer given by all the world leaders in 2005, that it needs to be more legitimate, it needs to be more effective, and it needs its decisions to be implemented on the ground. That's why the Council has to be reformed. Right. So there is unanimous, including the countries which oppose it, they have joined that mandate in 2005. So I find it very difficult to understand why they want to backtrack.
So to wrap up this section of the Security Council, so your final take on it, optimism, pessimism?
Well, if today in 2018 disruption is the new norm in international relations, as last year's Raisina dialogue focused on, then I would not be surprised if the intergovernmental negotiation process is left to drift along as it is drifting, and a group of countries which are keen on having the reform through the resolution of the General Assembly to amend the Charter, table a resolution with 128 co-sponsors. Because that's all you need. You don't need complete consensus in the General Assembly, which the Assembly itself decided in 1998. You need only 2/3 majority, and that's 128 countries. And I think given the experience that we've had in some of our other initiatives of getting countries to co-sponsor, by co-sponsoring, countries put their names on the paper. So you don't have to worry whether they'll be there in the hall on the day of the vote or not. You need 128 co-sponsors to table a resolution, and that is the reality that the opponents of this in the intergovernmental process should be aware of. I haven't given you the anecdote of it, but
so let's go back to the anecdote.
There is an anecdote. Okay. Well, the anecdote is actually before the decision on the 122-member text was adopted, there was a bit of non-diplomatic maneuver, which involved sitting in the office of the President of the General Assembly, being asked to not table the text in the interests of consensus and the fact that the 70th anniversary of the United Nations was going to be upon us, and looking around and seeing that the countries which wanted reform and who are represented in that room by their groupings did not know what to do but were very unhappy with this proposition. So the solution was a very Indian solution, to stage a walkout. And if you saw that morning, it was a Saturday morning, the walkout from the President of the General Assembly's chamber, first India, followed by the other G4, followed by the L69, followed by the Africa group, followed by everybody. So then the writing was clear on the wall that those permanent members and the coffee club who didn't want any of this to be done realized that if the decision on the 122-member text was to be put to a vote, it would be carried by more than a 2/3 majority. Because at that time, Africa and Asia were united. 108 countries were completely united on that text, plus the Caribbean. So it was a fascinating experience. Wow. But I had to lead the walkout.
That's a moment to treasure.
That's a moment to treasure.
You also saw a change, I think, during your tenure. I mean, we have been playing a very important role, over the past 70 odd years with contributing troops to UN peacekeeping. It was while you were the permanent representative that it really got upped and there was more attention to it. Do you want to take us to that?
Well, I look back, probably there were two reasons for that. The first was we were at that stage of negotiations for reimbursements to countries which were contributing troops.
And we got more money.
We got more money, but it was a very interesting negotiation because in the finance, in the fifth committee, in the budget committee, and thereafter, the negotiations centered around two sets of issues. The first set of issues was how would we do this reimbursement? And I think the good thing, and I hope it continues till the next round of discussions on reimbursements, was to use the system of what we call indexation. So it meant doing a survey of troop contributing countries, both from developed as well as the developing worlds, and coming up with a figure which would be more or less an average figure, taking the costs of both sets of countries. And the second was, of course, to decide on how to implement it given the constraints on the financing and budgeting of peacekeeping operations. So the survey was very, very critical, and I think the one thing that we did as a delegation was to support institutionalizing negotiations through the survey. It made more sense than going every time into these negotiations on a bilateral or a plurilateral basis and being subjected to pressures through other means. So my British counterpart, Sir Mark Lyle Grant, was very, very supportive of this mechanism, and I'm glad that the two of us were able to agree on it, and I hope that it continues. But the problem arose with the figure and the budget for the figure. The figure, when we arrived at the figure, was somewhere around $1,800 a month, and it had gone up. The UN was paying $1,000 a month. So it had gone up to 1,800 basically because of the costs of training troops for peacekeeping by Italy. The costs of Italy were much, much higher than the costs of any other developed country. And therefore, we had to arrive at a decision on how to adjust this. So the compromise we worked out was that we would not demand 1,800, but we would move close to 1,800. And we would agree as troop contributing countries to phase in the increase. So we phased it in 3 stages. So the first year it went to 12, then to 14, and then to 13, and now it's at 14. And that's where it ended up. So that was one issue which gave a certain focus because now every soldier, for example, who's gone there from the Indian Army under UN peacekeeping, gets a direct credit into his bank account of $1,400 a month for his duty in the United Nations, over and above what he gets as his salary from the Indian Army. And I think that makes a lot of difference in terms of morale and effectiveness on the ground. The second thing that happened was that the crisis that provoked the mandates of the Security Council made it clear to countries like us who had been non-permanent members and then were outside by the time I reached the Security Council, that the Security Council was not able to get its mandate formulation right in terms of what was happening on the ground. And the classic case in my time was South Sudan, which unfortunately is one of the biggest tragedies in the world today, and for which there is an unnecessary confrontation between the UN mission and the government of South Sudan. But the reason that this problem arose was because of 2 factors. One goes back to what we were talking about, the fact that not a single African country is represented permanently in the Security Council, and therefore the formulation of mandates on a country like South Sudan had to come from countries which were earlier involved with that part of the world as colonial powers. And there is a mismatch in that. And the second reason was that the permanent members of the Council did not want to hear anything directly from the troop contributing countries about what was happening on the ground. And in South Sudan, where, for example, troops from India were at the forefront of protecting civilians, we had some inputs to give, both in terms of the policy in terms of the resources needed, which the Council was not willing to accept. Although Article 44 of the UN Charter clearly says that if a country is giving troops, is not a member of the Council, then the country should be invited to participate in discussions on the mandate. And this was the problem that we had. So therefore, I mean, again anecdotally, but I organized a briefing meeting on South Sudan in my mission. And I am happy that, out of 15, 14 members of the Security Council came. The only one who didn't come was China. But they came and they listened to the inputs we wanted to give, which we should have given to the Council. And that brought us face to face with a reality which had been going on for some time, which was that the Security Council had outsourced its function under Article 44 of direct consultations with the members to the Secretariat. Now, it is not fair to outsource a member function to the Secretariat, because then the blame goes to the Secretariat, and I don't think that's fair.
There was also the wall.
The wall in two parts. The year I reached, we had every year, but the first time I participated in the medal ceremony for the peacekeepers who had laid down their lives, I noticed that it was being organized in an auditorium, the Dag Hammarskjöld auditorium, which is a small auditorium, but probably that was not the big issue. The issue was that there was no one from the top participating in the function. It was presided over by the Under Secretary General, and then somebody else was there, and a military advisor, and so on. And I felt that this was not right in terms of in memory of the troop keepers who had laid down their lives. So we in the Peacekeeping Committee, C34, and then in the General Assembly passed a resolution that the next time the UN Peacekeepers Day is commemorated, the Secretary General should lay a wreath at the Peacekeeping Memorial in the UN building. Most people had forgotten that in 1988, when the UN Peacekeeping got the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, that money was used for constructing a fountain and a kind of memorial. And that's the place where the wreath had to be laid. So I'm glad that the Secretary General, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, during my time, he rose to that resolution and he made it a point to lay the wreath at that memorial. And from there grew the other idea of what is being done to remember the contributions of the individual soldiers who've laid down their lives. At that time, there were 3,300. Today, that's 3,700. The numbers are growing. And again, in the General Assembly, the discussion and the decision was that a memorial wall with the names of the fallen peacekeepers would be built in the UN. And our Prime Minister had participated in the Leaders' Summit on Peacekeeping in September 2015, and he made this statement that India is ready to contribute, including financially, to this memorial. I am a bit surprised that nothing has actually happened since then, and I'm sad about it.
You were also there when the International Year of Yoga was, the resolution went through, and it went through like a dream.
Yeah, the resolution came about because of the proposal made by our Prime Minister on the 27th of September. Initially, there was no background to this idea in the United Nations, and we had to wait for the conclusion of the high-level segment in early October before we could sound other delegations on how they would help us to implement this idea. But during that time, we had a consultation within our delegation, and we wanted to see which would be the most effective way to implement the resolution. The traditional way was to take it through a committee, the second committee, because it was linked with global health, and then to have it in the General Assembly, but it was obvious that that would take much more time. The second option was to go directly into the General Assembly and have consultations in the General Assembly and then move the resolution. We decided to opt for the second because we wanted to do it quickly, but in order to ensure that it would succeed, we needed to make sure that the vast majority of the General Assembly would support it. And because the Group of 77 and China dominates decision making in the General Assembly, having 134 out of 193 members, it was important to gauge the mood of the Group of 77 and China. And it was in that context that I had to decide on how to approach the Group of 77 and China. And I was guided in my decision to reach out to China first by the fact that we had seen television visuals of a link between a school, Tagore School in New Delhi, and a school in Shanghai, who are using video conferencing to teach each other the yoga and Tai Chi. And I took a Xinhua report of this to the Chinese ambassador, whom I met personally, and I said that if you could look at it in terms of following up your president's visit to India. And he was receptive and said that I need permission from my authorities, give me 3 days. So at the end of the 3 days, he rang me and said that he had got the approval and China would be a co-sponsor of a resolution to declare 21st June as the International Day of Yoga. So, you know, when a co-sponsorship sheet has India and China on it, then a lot of countries have no hesitation in joining on. Of course, there were countries which took a little longer to agree. There were countries where yoga is a tradition and they came on board quickly, but there were countries where yoga was not a tradition and they took a little more time. And of course, at the end, we had 177 co-sponsors, including India, and we were able to do it in 75 days, both of which are records in a certain kind of, in that sense, for this kind of resolution. And only 16 countries were not able to co-sponsor because of their own attitude or views on yoga. But I'm glad it worked out, and soon we'll be marking the 4th International Day of Yoga.
You referred to the SDGs in your previous answer, and you were there at a time when the MDG timeline was reaching its conclusion and the SDG dialoguing was happening frenetically across civil society and at the UN. What role did you play? How exciting was it? What was India's inputs into that discussion?
Well, I reached a little while after the mandate of the Rio Summit of 2012 for the SDGs had been brought into the General Assembly. And since it was open to all member states of the General Assembly, the Secretariat had suggested that there should be constituencies so that each country would get a chance to be represented, but would be represented by a constituency. Now, in the case of India, the constituency was India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Well, countries which had a similar interest in development, but probably different approaches to development. I had come from Delhi and knowing of some of the programs that were being introduced and in the next year were introduced in a much broader scale on development, inclusive development. I thought that the constituency idea would not really be workable for a country like India because we had a much larger bandwidth of issues to bring onto the table as compared to the other two countries with us. So we started participating in the discussions on the Sustainable Development Goals as India. And I think that made, with hindsight, sense to do it because when you look at the targets and the goals, if India achieves its national targets, then most of the SDG goals would be met. And therefore, India's participation as India was, I think, an important thing to do. And we did that. I think the 2 stages of the SDG negotiations were done in a way in which, again, this is the big success story of the United Nations. We were able to get all 193 countries involved. But more important, as you mentioned, we were able to do these negotiations with the participation of multi-stakeholders, of businesses, of academia, of civil society and youth. And I think that the way in which the 2 chairpersons, conducted the SDG negotiations is exemplary because they were able to bring in inputs from the other stakeholders by having separate sessions with them, but reporting the main issues into the member-driven governmental process. And in the interface between the governmental and the non-governmental processes, any issues that required ironing out or coordination were done by the 2 co-chairs, the Ambassador of Hungary and the Ambassador of Kenya. And you know, the Ambassador of Kenya has now written a book, Ambassador Macharia Kamau, and I think it should be required reading because he's given the negotiations, the background in a very, very good way. But I think the role of individual diplomats in steering such negotiations is something that should be taken as a case study for those who look to the United Nations as the way to implement international cooperation on these issues. Now, the kinds of goals, you mentioned the MDGs, and we had our experience with the MDGs. One of the lessons we drew from the MDG experience was that they had been formulated outside the government, the General Assembly process, and handed over to member states. The second was that they were not applicable to all member states but only to the developing countries. So these two things we wanted to avoid because for us development and sustainable development was a holistic concept, and especially after the mandate given by the Rio 2012 summit. So what we did was to make it a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach in which the national priorities and national goals would actually form the commitments to the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. And I think in a way it's good that we did that because every year in July the high-level political forum meets to review progress made. It's a bit like the universal peer review on human rights in Geneva. It's the same kind of approach, that it is a consultative approach and an approach in which if a member state wants help, then other member states are there to understand and then to help to the extent they can. It shows that you actually work like one family. And for India, the other thing was in the nature of the goals. Now, for us, the MDG goals are critically important because they deal with health and social issues. But India itself was transforming and is transforming. And for us, development without focusing on the economic goals did not make much sense because without economic growth, you could not address some of the goals which were the social goals. So we were happy to have participated in supporting the inclusion of some of the SDGs like infrastructure, like clean energy, which of course is a common goal for many, employment, inequalities of income, and consumption, because consumption again is a very big issue. So these 5 or 6 goals were pushed by India, and in the process we pushed one issue which I hope will gain traction in the years ahead, which is the need for transfer of technology to accelerate development. This is an area where the United Nations so far has not taken a very prominent role, and initially it was Brazil and India, but subsequently Brazil did not come up because of the internal issues so much. So it was left essentially to India to force a decision in the Addis Ababa summit on financing for development, which is part of the sustainable goal process, on the creation of a technology facilitation mechanism. Now that I think is an achievement for Indian multilateral diplomacy. Our team was led by Mr. Jayant Sinha, who was those days the Minister of State for Finance. And therefore, if we can get the focus on technology for development, the Sustainable Development Goal agenda would be really accelerated, I think.
And also, it also gives us muscle in the South-South cooperation realm also. And, you know, just last week when the Secretary General commended India for leading those innovations, I think that's an important thing that we have achieved.
But South-South cooperation has been something that we have incubated in the UN system. We really didn't have to do it, but we decided to do it. When we brought in the IBSA Trust Fund, the India, Brazil, South Africa Trust Fund, and the 3 ambassadors are the 3 directors of this fund in New York. And we opened up the process to other developing countries from the South to suggest projects which could be financed by this trust fund. Now the trust fund grew. During the time I was there, it had reached almost $30 million, but it started from very small beginnings. We were able to do almost 28 projects in those 3 years, and you know, it showed us that it could be done. And as I said, we wanted to show that it was part of the United Nations ethos. So we anchored the IBSA Trust Fund with the Office of South-South Cooperation in the UN system. And the Office of South-South Cooperation was actually supposed to gain in prominence. Unfortunately, due to the budget negotiations, that office got downplayed a little, but I'm sure that its time will come. And now with the reforms that have taken place in the UNDP system, South-South cooperation probably will get more of a prominence. But the note of caution that I'd always strike is that the South-South cooperation that India has championed has been driven by the country where the project is to be done. It is not driven by the consultants and the outside experts. And that is a critical difference because it's a qualitative difference.
India growing muscle power economically, hopefully politically, worldwide. And yet, when we're talking of the region, we're always being compared to China. You said in a couple of instances, fabulous cooperation and collaboration with China. How do you, as a former ambassador to the UN, see the power play between India and China on the global stage?
Well, in the economic area, I've mentioned about the collaboration we have in the Group of 77 in China, which for a long time was convergent, but started diverging ever since China decided to sponsor its own Boao Forum and its own vision of development. I think the vision that is being espoused by China on development is not completely endorsed by India because of one reason, and that is that vision of development which China espouses doesn't contain the human dimension. India's vision of development has been driven by human resources, and if you notice, since 1964, our technical and economic cooperation program with almost 70 or 80 countries in the world, which has produced hundreds and thousands of people trained in India, has focused on human resources as being the driving factor for development. I don't think the Chinese are training people in the way we are training. So therefore, there's a certain divergence in view. The second, of course, is what I've mentioned about the development project being led by the country where the project is going to be, rather than being foisted onto the country. And I think that these issues are now coming out into the open with the Indian and Chinese divergence on the Belt and Road Initiative or the One Belt, One Road Initiative. It's basically a philosophical approach to development. Our approach goes back to eradication of poverty, which we articulated way back in 1972 at the first UN Conference on the Environment, Indira Gandhi, and how she was criticized by the world media and by so many countries for trying, what they thought was trying to duck the responsibility for climate change by talking about poverty. But today, the first SDG is for eradication of poverty. So we have vindicated this perspective. And I think that we need to actually talk more about it, the human dimension of development. So this is one area in the economic field where we see a certain divergence which needs to be bridged. China, on the other hand, has done something which India probably has dropped off the radar screen in the UN system, which is that today the entire UN Secretariat structure on economic and social affairs is dominated by Chinese nationals, the Under-Secretary General, the directors, and so on. And you have no Indian presence in this area at all. The last one we had was someone who went off as director of UNITAR, and after that we have no one. So in that sense, there will be less opportunity for India in the implementation phase of the SDGs to provide its own perspective. And I think that that's something that needs to be taken into account. In the political sphere, of course, it's much more clear. China is a permanent member of the Security Council, India is not, and China does not want India to be a permanent member. So it's a clear statement of national interests. But here again, I would say that, and I've said it in public, that there are, if you look at the composition of the permanent membership of the Security Council in terms of developed and developing countries, then actually China is in a minority of one. And if they have more developing countries as permanent members, it will help the overall interest, even of the Chinese interest that I've spoken of in development, because there are issues in their development perspective which are being right now opposed politically among some of these important countries, including some permanent members. They are opposing the Chinese version of development. So they need some support within the system. And therefore, I thought it would make sense for them to to agree to countries like India, Brazil, etc., to come in. But we took the countries out of the equation in the process of Security Council reform, because now it's the reform to create more seats, and to occupy those seats you have to go through an election and get 2/3 majority. And my point has always been to countries which say, I don't like this country or that country, the permanent members, I say that if you're a permanent member, it should be the easiest thing for you to get 64 countries in the General Assembly to support you. That's all you need to prevent a country from being elected.
Right.
So
the other interesting thing, I think, that sort of happened quietly was, whenever we spoke of South Asia, it was always India-Pakistan. And I think you worked towards blurring or deleting that hyphen and to say that India has to be seen on its own terms and not in the terms of a South Asian hyphen. Do you want to speak about India-Pakistan during your tenure at the UN?
with Pakistan, the month of September is probably the worst month in the India-Pakistan relationship in the UN, because that's when the high-level segment of the General Assembly takes place, and there's inevitably going to be a statement on the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, and to which there will be a response from the Indian delegation. But I think it's important to note that even if the statement from the Pakistani side comes at the level of the Prime Minister or the high dignitary, the response from the Indian side is taken at the lowest possible level, which denotes the kind of desire of India not to get sucked into a war of words with Pakistan at a high level. In 2013 and 2014, there was an atmosphere of moving ahead with the dialogue. And therefore, there was a certain bilateral framework which encouraged more coordination with Pakistan in the United Nations. In the economic field, as I said before, India and Pakistan do collaborate. Even the selection of Shamshad Akhtar as the head of SCAP was done without any problem from the Indian delegation when we were consulted on this. So this shows that there is not a knee-jerk reaction to Pakistan from India in the United Nations. We very much wanted to co-opt them into the areas of priority for us. One area was countering terrorism, and we thought that if they could support this initiative that had been taken on a comprehensive convention on international terrorism, that would have sent a very strong message. Unfortunately, they didn't rise to that challenge. And today they understand and they are suffering the consequences of terrorism. They're seeking terrorists who are probably not in the territory of Pakistan. And the key point of the comprehensive convention was you prosecute the alleged terrorist, or if you cannot prosecute, you extradite that person for prosecution elsewhere. That's the core of the comprehensive convention. And it's a principle which every state should actually close its eyes and subscribe to, because most states do have to use the rule of law to prosecute terrorism. If you don't, then the countering of terrorism takes place without the rule of law, and that has its own consequences.
Today, when you look back at your tenure at the UN, is there anything that you would have done differently, or you wished you had done differently?
Well, there's something I think I could have looked at much more, with much more interest, and that is the multi-stakeholder format of negotiations. I think for a country like India, that is a new approach. We saw it work in the Sustainable Development Goals, but I also saw it work in the review that we did of the Tunis Agenda. And I think that bringing in the voice of going beyond governments and getting in the voice of stakeholders will strengthen the United Nations outputs, as well as and enable the UN to implement its outcomes. And one area where I think we needed to do more, and probably my regret was that I wasn't able to do as much, was in addressing the challenge that we face as a global society from the new technologies, which we conveniently club together as cyber technologies. I think that the UN, because it doesn't have a multi-stakeholder negotiation on cyberspace, is not being able to respond to the challenges that the world with agility.
Yeah.
It's done the governmental group of experts on norms for cyberspace, but those are in terms of the disarmament part of the United Nations. There's nothing happening in the economic part. There's very little happening in the human rights part. And there's a whole world outside which is driven by cyber technologies to which the UN is unable to respond. So after leaving New York, I have been advocating beginning discussions on concluding a convention on cyberspace in the same way that many years ago the United Nations responded to the challenge faced in the maritime domain and began discussions and eventually negotiations leading to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, or UNCLOS. I think we need something of that kind, but a 21st century format. So it would be multi-stakeholder, it would have an enforcement mechanism for dispute settlement and so on. And I've been advocating this since I've come back.
Any incident or memorable moment that you want to share with us to conclude your interview?
Well, one thing happened when I was there for which I was not prepared, and I don't think in India there's much of a memory of it, was to actually inaugurate an event to mark the transfer of the archives of the UN War Crimes Commission to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And when I asked why should I sort of have to speak on this, and they said, don't you know that India was a member of the UN War Crimes Commission? And I regret very much to say, but I did not know of this fact at all. The War Crimes Commission functioned from 1943 to 1948. The Indian representative was the High Commissioner of India in London, because we had opened our first diplomatic mission abroad in London in 1920. So there was a wealth of information in those archives, 36,000 files, which were generated by reports given by Allied armies from the ground. And there are two sort of aspects to this which I wasn't aware of, but which I think are important when we today look at issues like R2P and responsibility to protect and issues of human rights, is that when you are given information, how do you respond to it? Now, in the War Crimes Commission, the response was that the big powers, the four policemen of the world, as they called themselves when they became permanent members, they said these reports are going to be dealt with by us and not by the United Nations War Crimes Commission. You're not going to apply a civil law approach or a universal approach. You're going to allow us to do what we want to do unilaterally on the strength of our power. And that led to the creation of the military tribunals of Nuremberg and Tokyo. And in India, I think it's important to say it, because the reason why Justice Radha Vinod Pal in Tokyo gave his dissenting judgment is basically because he didn't agree with what these military tribunals represented. It's not that he went into the other issues of the moral issues. He was looking at it in terms of the legal issue. And the second thing is that because we don't have a memory of the UN War Crimes Commission, we are quite oblivious to some of the facts that I discovered later when I was working in the UN and in New York. And that was the contribution that we ourselves had made to the first sort of decisions of the United Nations on human rights issues. We do talk about anti-apartheid and the change in South Africa. That is a little better known. But no one talks about the co-sponsorship by India of the Convention on Genocide. No one talks about it. And not many people talk about India's contribution to gender equality in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by Hansa Mehta. So these are the untold stories which I think the new generation of Indians must be aware of. And it flows out of our own experience on how we got independence. Because the equal participation of women and men in the freedom struggle, the human values which drove the freedom struggle, which made, for example, Gandhiji call off the non-cooperation movement when the Chauri Chaura incident happened. Now, these kinds of issues are issues which are relevant for us even more, so in the 21st century. And I think that this is a place where India should and can maintain its leadership role, the role of being the voice of a large part of humanity.
Ambassador Mukherjee, it's been a privilege and a pleasure of chatting with you. Thank you for your time and this fund of knowledge that you've so willingly offered here in this interview.